Yes, it's sharing fun. All right, welcome to the Battleground BCI webinar, Crisis Ready, Chaos Free. I am Craig Goldberg, CEO and founder of Battleground, based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been doing BCM and resilience for a very long time, and look forward to sharing some of what I've learned in this webinar. And I'm joined today by Peter Duffy. Peter, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. So Peter Duffy is my name. I too am dialing in from Melbourne, and very, very much looking forward to this discussion. Just a wee bit about myself. So I've been with Battleground for the last 4 years, but I've known my partner in crime here, Mr. Goldberg, longer than probably either of us care to admit. Originally, when I was a client of Craig's many years ago, and so I've traversed the journey from client to colleague, which has been great fun. And so I too am looking forward to sharing perspectives and experiences along the way.
Thank you. So just a bit about us, because I think the context is very important. So Battleground is all about doing consulting and software for business continuity, crisis, incident, and operational and enterprise risk. We consult with clients across all industries and all sizes and governments and the like. So what we're going to talk about today is not specifically about one industry or one company size. It's really coming from the learnings of hundreds and hundreds of exercises that we've done over the last 18 months or so, that we've kind of brought together into this idea of what is it that can help you exercise better, or what are some of the pitfalls that we've seen, or what are some of the learnings that we've had by looking at incidents and applying them in exercises and seeing what comes out of it. So today is all about Peter and I sharing some of those experiences, sharing some of those learnings, but also to answer your questions. So please put your questions in the webinar chat or in the Q&A as we go. We will have time for formal questions and answers at the end, but it's a lot more fun when it is interactive. So please get involved as we go, ask questions. We can mix and match and flip and flop as we need to make it work. So,
sorry, errant pressing of the slide button there. So just building on that, 4 key areas we want to cover off. Why do we exercise? What are those key principles around conducting those exercises? How do we exercise? And what do we learn along the way? And just to reiterate Craig's point, please feel free to raise your questions as we go along, but we will also canvass questions at the end.
Someone's having issues with sound, but I'm hoping it's only Robert and not everyone else. But if you are having issues with sound, maybe let us know and we can try and fix it. So one of the things I like to do when I present is ask AI some questions, because as we all know, AI is the flavor of the month. And it's always interesting to challenge some of your thinking, challenge what you've learned, and challenge what you do with AI. So we asked 4 different AI models. What are the top 5 things to consider when planning and running a crisis test? I did this last night to get the latest and greatest information. Now, what's interesting, before we look at the results, is that all 4 models pretty much came up with the same answers. Now, when we ran this question through them 3 months ago, 6 months ago and 9 months ago, it did not have the same answers. And Perplexity actually had the most different, and it's aligned now. So that's really interesting. And we were wondering whether maybe a lot more people are talking about exercising, are thinking it through, are asking AI the questions, and the models are learning and converging in what they think. Regardless, the 5 things that AI believes you need to consider when planning and running a crisis test: clear objectives and scope, a realistic scenario, which we'll definitely talk about today, understanding who to involve and their roles, communications and stakeholder management, understanding what success looks like, and then conducting a thorough debrief. Those are a really neat way to succinctly understand what it is that can build a really robust and good crisis test or incident test. And so we're going to use those 5 things throughout the presentation today. But if we do skip any, or if there's any you want us to delve in as we get further along, please just ask.
Thanks, Craig. So that then brings us to this fundamental question of why. Why do we exercise? And, we could talk about good practice, and we could talk about meeting standards, and we could talk about a million different things. But at the end of the day, this unpredictable world in which we live in, the events that are coming at us from seemingly every direction, they provide the real reason as to why we exercise. Whether it is people in extraordinarily senior national security positions sharing details on WhatsApp, whether it's a cyber attack that shuts down a huge retail operation like Marks and Spencer for many, many months, whether it's a small fire in a substation at adjacent Heathrow Airport that suddenly has literally hundreds of aeroplanes being diverted across Europe and turned back to their country of origin, or whether it's just a couple of people who are a bit unlucky with the kiss cam at a Coldplay concert and the implications for their organization that followed that. This is an unpredictable world. It's a dynamic world. And if we're not prepared, and if we're not prepared through exercise, we are going to be in all sorts of bother when a real incident comes. Craig, I know there's a couple here that you've taken a particular interest in. You might want to tease out a little more.
Yes, and especially for those joining us from non-Australia, as we might say. So part of why we wanted to put these up to show why we exercise is not because they're interesting, right? But also to talk about some of the back stories, and also to start to tease out some of the concepts. So the one in the middle there, Optus. So Optus is a very large telecommunications provider in Australia. They had probably Australia's first major cyber attack where millions of records were accessed. And the reason it became such a shambles and such a talking point is a couple of weeks after the major incident, the CEO of Optus was hauled in front of the Senate, so for a government inquiry, and they were asked very simply, did you exercise this scenario? And the CEO responded, no, we never exercised this. We never thought it would get this bad. We'd exercised components of it, but never the end-to-end. So exercising at the extremes with large but plausible scenarios is very important. And there are enough examples nowadays that the argument of, well, that could never happen doesn't fly anymore, right? That could never happen, that the CEO and the head of HR is caught kissing at a concert, right? The fact that you got the blue screen of death where the software used to protect you from cyber attacks is causing you the issue, is part of the thinking. You have to think outside the square when you're planning your scenarios. The one at the bottom right, a joint statement from UniSuper. UniSuper is a very large pension fund or superannuation fund here in Australia. They had everything on Google Cloud. One day, the Google Cloud environment they were on disappeared like that. Without warning, the entire Google Cloud went away. They were offline for over a week, if I'm not mistaken. It came down to one tick box in one screen that had been accidentally ticked about not renewing the subscription at the right time. Something small can bring down an entire organization. So think outside the square. And when you want inspiration for what to exercise on, what do you think? Why are we doing this? Come back to the large stories and the impact that they have.
I think that last one, the UniSuper example, is particularly fascinating for me, because there was so much speculation externally and no doubt internally in that organization as to what had caused it, and it was such a tiny issue at the end of the day. And sometimes that's one of the really important things when you're exercising. You'll observe people who want to move into detective mode and try to solve the riddle, find the bad guy, all that stuff, which is a pretty natural, normal thing to do. But actually focus on the impact, focus on the resolution, the investigation, and so on can come down the track. That's a particularly fascinating one for me.
Yeah. And we've had a question in the Q&A from Laura in New Zealand. Finding the balance between that challenging exercise but a simple story, and how do you create that without going overboard? And it's really a fascinating topic. And I remember one of my guys, when they joined us the first time, joined the company, and there was an exercise that day. So they came along. And I think there were maybe 15 injects planned. So 15 things we wanted to throw in. And we used 5. And we achieved an amazing outcome. And he turned to me at the end, he says, my gut instinct would have been, you just have to do what you've planned. But I realize now that less is more. You've got to read the room, and you need to think through, what do I actually need to achieve my objectives? Come back to your objectives. So less is more in an exercise. The most amazing one I heard of recently, because I'm planning with 2 others a panel at the BCI Global Conference in November. We've been talking about different stories and war stories from our exercises. And one of my fellow panelists turned around and said, the best exercise I've ever run was one line. A laptop has been lost. He said, from there, everything unraveled. Where's the whose laptop? What group were they from? What does that mean? What secret information's on it? What does it mean that we've lost the laptop? So just simple things can create really big stories. But I think the lesson to me is, don't be afraid to go extreme. Don't be afraid to test things that someone says can never happen. But you do it in a way that is easy to digest.
Right. Agreed.
We'll come back to the other questions as we go. All right. That's a good segue to key principle number 1, keep it simple and succinct, or the KISS principle, otherwise known as keep it simple, stupid. Now, this diagram of what is organizational resilience, I use a lot. If you ever come to anything Battleground, you will know this. And it's all about breaking resilience down into manageable chunks, because when you exercise, you can't exercise everything. So one of the first things is understanding, are we exercising an emergency plan, a crisis or incident plan, a business continuity plan, or an IT disaster recovery plan, or cyber plan, or whatever other plan. But each of them have a different goal, a different outcome, a different way of working, and therefore a different exercising approach. So understanding your objectives, understanding the plan you're trying to exercise or plans and how they join, and then breaking it down into clear, simple steps is really important. And if you notice in the middle there, we've got communications going throughout. It's inevitable that communications will be involved in any exercise you do because it's so fundamental to the way that businesses operate. It's so fundamental to how you manage the reputational fallout. So communications is key. Picking the right plan to test and exercise based on the team you want to exercise, and then breaking it down into manageable chunks is really important.
And then when we do that, and we've been using these terms interchangeably, really important when we set our objectives and when we work with a team that we understand that what we are doing is an exercise, actually not a test. If it is a test to any extent, it is a test of process, it's a test of plan. It shouldn't be a test of people. It's about exercising people. It's about building skills and a capability and experience, and through that, confidence. And so understanding where we are on a maturity cycle and pitching our exercise to that level is really important. In Battleground, because we are wedded to simplicity in all things, we run a maturity model that talks about crawl, walk, run. It's understanding you've got to crawl before you walk, before you run. And you reflect that in the exercise. So it's really important, understand the team, understand the people, understand where they are at collectively in their maturity, and pitch the exercise appropriately so that the team is learning, the team is challenged, but it never feels like they're broken. I know Craig's a particular fan of the going to the gym analogy. First time you go to the gym after a long spell, you can go for a 2-3 hour workout, but you're probably going to be in all sorts of bother for days thereafter. But if you build that fitness level up over time, in the not too distant future, a couple of hours workout will be standard. It'll be a good experience. You'll get that wee bit more fitter. You'll move on next time. So giving people that an exercise that's challenging, but a learning activity, not a test, is, I think, really a really fundamental thing.
Yeah. And I do think coming in with the open mind and calming everyone down when you walk in the room by explaining that and explaining it's not a test, and understanding that in an exercise, really, there's no right or wrong answer for most things, right? Because it's a way for them to experiment and try. And I know I've run 2 exercises side by side, same story, different teams. You might have half the primaries, half the alternates in one room, and half the primaries, half the alternates in the other room. You run the same exercise and they will come up with slightly different answers, or they'll come up with slightly different outcomes. And when we've debriefed with them, they've all agreed that neither of them was right or wrong. They were just slightly different outcomes. And that's okay. And that's why we exercise, to tease out these differences and nuances, which can be really interesting.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about the how and how we exercise. And there's really 4 fundamental elements to this. It's about planning, it's about preparation, it's about the delivery, and it's about capturing the improvements. When we plan, the planning and the preparation are just so important. The first part of the planning is being really, really clear on what your objectives are, what the exercise objectives are, what the learning objectives are for the group, and being really on board with that. And then segueing that knowledge into your preparation as you build all the artifacts you need to support the exercise, as you understand and bring clarity to the roles and who the people are going to be, and making sure you understand very clearly who's who and who's playing what role on the day. And then logistics is so vitally important as well, and planning that delivery. We know more and more nowadays, and it's certainly true in Australia. You'll never have a team of people or a group of people who are all in the one room at the one time anymore. You'll always have a blend of people online, people in person, other locations, so on and so forth. Understanding those logistics and being prepared to manage those logistics is super, super important. That then segues you into the delivery of the exercise. And we've touched on this a wee bit earlier, but I think it's a really important thing, is being clear in that flexibility around your delivery, understanding that you can try to pin down the exercise steps to the nth degree, but inevitably people are going to make decisions, they're going to share perspectives, they're going to act in ways that you haven't predicted. And that's okay. That's more than okay. That's what you're looking for. So being responsive to that in your facilitation of the exercise becomes vital. And so it's that analogy that was shared earlier. Nothing wrong with preparing a dozen, 15 injects, but being really clear, you're probably not going to play them all. You're going to respond, and as a facilitator, you're going to be flexible in terms of how the event is playing out on the day. And then finally, capturing those improvement opportunities, the so-called hot debrief, keeping people there to get those visceral reactions and responses to the exercise. That's where the gold is. That's where the really, really important learnings come from. And then you build out on that in your reflection and so on over at the conclusion of the exercise. But that's such a vital step, is to not just conclude the exercise time and have people move away. Grabbing those ideas, getting those visceral responses is really, really important.
And I think, Pete, what do you reckon? Like 75% of the time allocated for play and 25% for debrief?
As a general proposition, that sort of thing, yes. Yeah, for sure. And to the earlier point of understanding the maturity of the group, sometimes there's a fair chunk of introductory material as well to set the exercise up for success, not just in the days and weeks leading to exercise day, but in the introductory remarks and scene setting at the start as well. But with you completely, Greg, you should not be frightened of setting aside, as you say, 25% of the time for the debrief.
Yeah, yeah. And also, so if we think about the planning, I know, we used to ask questions and then we kind of document on the side the objectives and leave them there. And more, we keep bringing back almost every planning meeting, bring everyone back to what are the objectives, what are we trying to achieve? Because it's really easy in planning to get carried away because it's fun. It's fun to try break the business. Oh, we can do this, or we can do that. Hang on. Is that going to help us achieve the objectives? Because if it's not going to help us achieve the objectives, it's going to confuse the situation and making it inefficient in the way that we use our time. Because you are going to be time poor, right? I know with us, we struggle with some boards to get more than 30 to 45 minutes at a board. Management is often easier, but getting that time and using it efficiently to achieve the objectives is really important. And I think that preparation piece you mentioned, Pete, is important as well. Just practice it, go over it, put yourself in their shoes. So when you're going through the injects, thinking, what would I do if that was me? How would I react if that was me? Because that can help tease out what do you think the reaction's going to be to what you're saying to them.
I think that's exactly right. And a big part of that preparation as well is finding people in the business who you bring into your tent, those subject matter experts, who won't necessarily be participants in the exercise on the day, but they can really help build the story, build the credibility of the story, so that you get past that, oh, but that wouldn't happen piece, which can derail an exercise if you're not careful. And so that's a very important part as well, I think.
Yep. All right. So what have we found? What have we learned? We break down our exercise into 4 key themes, if you like. Generally, these themes hold for most exercises, and we bucket our learnings into these. So, activation and escalation. How does the team activate? How does it escalate? How do you get the team together? For those who have run an exercise, you'll know that you can either start with the team getting an invite, they come to a room, they sit there, they sip their coffees waiting for the crisis to start. Or you can start it outside the room and have it percolate and escalate and see how that works. A lot of our learnings we've had is that from the incident happening somewhere in the business to getting to the crisis or incident team can be really, really hard. And that part in the middle very often breaks. So having an exercise that tests natural activation, naturally, how would this happen? How would you hear about it? Can be really, really important. And the learnings can often be more than the actual exercise themselves, right? So we did one a couple of weeks ago where the incident happened in the business. The person who heard said, oh, I'll call my boss. Boss didn't answer. Called the next boss. Boss answered and said, I'm new. I have no idea what to do. And the person on the phone was like, I don't have anyone else to call. So we need to work this out. And there was a whole learning after around, well, we forgot to brief the guy about what he needs to do. So even small things like that in activation and escalation can be really important to understand. In the activation escalation part as well, we find generally, and I apologize for anyone in cyber and IT on the call, but IT teams generally hold on to incidents a long time before they escalate. I'm just saying that based on evidence that we have from our exercises, we have to force them to escalate. And it's sometimes our objective is to highlight that a team inside a business must escalate up and out of their team early so that we can solve things as we go rather than hold on, big bang. And now we have to solve other issues. So the activation and escalation component can be really, really important. And that could even be before you even start the actual exercise. Communication. So activation escalation also often highlights how do you communicate? How do your teams get the call that they need to come into the room? How do you get the team's messages or Zooms out there? How do you bring the team together? Who brings the team together? All those little things, even the admin-y things, can come unstuck in a crisis, right? So testing and exercising those small little components can be really, really important. So yeah, don't be afraid to exercise the bits before the crisis happens. It's also more real, right? So as I said, a crisis team coming together with their coffees and sitting there waiting for the crisis to happen is not real. And they're not all going to be in the room and they're not all going to have a meeting invite. And yes, some of them will be out the room and some of them will have other things going on, and that's life. Role clarity. Pete, what do you think?
I always think about 2 dimensions in role clarity. So there's role clarity in terms of the team and the crisis team and exercising our roles as they might be described on roll cards and the like, and as part of our plan. And it's very important. It's very important to understand that. The other bit that often fascinates me in exercises is when you're in a situation where the crisis team looks an awful lot like, feels an awful lot like the executive team, say, in an organization. And then you've got this interesting dynamic of helping people to recognize that whilst this may feel like the same group we've got around the table, and it looks a lot like the same group we normally meet with every week or twice a week, whatever the case might be, we're actually playing a very different role in a very different context to our day-to-day activity. And so I always find that observing that challenge to be quite a fascinating one, particularly then where a crisis leader is not necessarily a chief executive, but a chief executive may well still be a participant in the group, and getting that dynamic right between those two people in and of itself can be a really interesting thing to observe in different organizations.
Role clarity and testing those roles is really important. I'll give you an example, a very sad, but one that really highlights this. And it comes also to testing those extreme examples, but the plausible and also emotive examples. So we ran an exercise where a team had to move from site A to site B, primary to alternate. So they got in the car. They actually physically, we made them get in the car, go to the other site. And then we simulated once they got there, they realized one of their team wasn't there. And we then got word that unfortunately one of them had had a car accident and passed away on the drive to the alternate site. And we actually gave that to the crisis team leader in a handout, basically said, you've received this phone call. And they held on to it for about 5 minutes and carried on with everything else. Eventually just walked out the room. And we followed them out and said, what's wrong? Why haven't you told the team? And they said, I thought I'd be okay as the crisis lead, but I actually can't handle this emotional stuff. I can't deal with it. It's too much for me. I don't think I'm suitable for the crisis lead. So they calmed down, came back in the room, we played the exercise. And after it, we debriefed it and we talked about, making sure that people are given the role that suits them, not because day to day they're in a role, but in a crisis, what suits them best. We came back 3 months later to do a follow-up exercise, and that crisis lead was now in a completely different role in the crisis team and was unbelievable, brilliant at the role, because we'd found the right role. And we found it out by doing an exercise that was emotional, was hard, but it was important to do and important to tease out these issues. In the chat, interesting. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, so there's that idea that having the support roles and the people who write things and do things in a team is important. And exercise is a really good way to tease out who's the doers, who are the thinkers, and who are those that are going to oversee, and have they been placed in the right role? And do you have someone who actually understands the process so that it's not just a jumble and turns into a regular exec meeting or regular board meeting? Really important.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's exactly where I was heading as well. That's the engine room in a crisis team. The often called the coordinator. Sometimes there's other titles, but I always like to think of that person as, they're the keeper of the process. They're the keeper of the plan, and their job is so important to keep people on track, to make sure things are being done end to end, agendas are being followed, and so on. And then, of course, the minute takers and the log keepers, extraordinarily hard work. And I think it's always important that every member of a crisis team, not just the leader, every member of a crisis team recognises the importance of those roles, respects those roles, and supports those people in their license to pause the meeting and say, no, we haven't covered this. No, I need clarity for the minutes on this, and so on and so forth. Super, super important. And it's a shared responsibility around a crisis team, in my view.
Yep. Okay, third one, decisions and actions. Decision making in a crisis team can be really difficult. And we've seen a lot of crisis teams that struggle to actually decide anything. They talk in circles, they get carried away and talk, but don't actually decide, or don't feel they have the right or the permission to decide things, or get so carried away in the situation, forget that they actually need to decide things and get things done. So decision making and watching out for it and teasing it out, how to get the team to decide things, can be really, really important. And it's the same with actions. So how do they make action decisions? How do they capture them? How do they follow them up? Are they lost in the wash? Can be a really good outcome to tease out in an exercise. I have something we call the someone effect, right? So how many times have you heard a team go, someone will do that. We need someone to do that. Or someone has to go run and get us coffee, and no one does it because no one has the name someone. Right? So the someone effect is a really interesting phenomenon in crisis teams. And we wait to see it, and we highlight it then in the debrief and go, here's 3 or 4 actions or things you said that someone did. Who's actually done that? And they look around the room and go, oh, no one. So the someone effect is a really interesting one to watch out for and tease out and teach people that nominating someone is not nominating, is nominating no one. You need to put names to actions. You need to follow up those actions, and you need to own it and take responsibility, because it's really easy for things to get lost in a team when it's fast paced or there's a high pressure situation. Now, Pete, you've been in
some
real life stuff
in our house. Sorry, Craig.
I was saying you've been in some real life stuff with that.
Yes, well, I was just being flippant and say I see the someone effect at our place every night when it's rubbish night and the bins have to be emptied, or it's time to empty the dishwasher. But absolutely, that idea of not having that clarity on who's responsible for things, that idea that then people turn around at the next meeting and nothing's been done is it's really, really important to have that discipline. And to that end, the other piece I wanted to mention, I just wanted to come back very quickly to those fundamental processes of recording decisions and understanding and recording the situational context in which those decisions were made. If you're in a circumstance where 3 years down the track, you're in court and you're being asked questions about what the team did and why they did it in a particular, circumstance where a crisis team was stood up, that notion of having a contemporaneous record that says this was the decision that the team made, and we made it in the context of this situational circumstances, it was understood and recorded at the time. I'm no lawyer, but I know that the term contemporaneous record means a lot when you find yourself, or if you're unfortunate enough to find yourself in that situation, trying to account for things many years later.
Yeah. Which brings us on to the last one, which is maybe the most important, maybe not, managing stakeholders. Now, stakeholders don't just mean outside. Stakeholders are inside as well. Don't forget, in today's day and age, what you say inside gets outside. What you say outside comes inside. With social media, nothing's a secret anymore. So managing your stakeholders in a consistent way is vital in a crisis, and testing that in an exercise becomes really important. So keep in mind, you've got internal stakeholders, you've got your staff, you've got your boards, you've got management. Externally, you might have boards, you might have service providers and vendors, you've got governments, you've got regulators, so on and so forth. Making sure that you consider all of them and consistent messages and consistent voice in that message becomes really important. So teasing that out in an exercise through different styles of injects, through giving over fake social feeds or fake newspaper articles or reporters phoning or board requests can really tease out, have they thought about all the different stakeholders and how they're going to manage them? And don't forget, time is of an essence with some of these things. If a media outlet wants a statement in 15 minutes, otherwise they're going to air, and you miss the 15 minutes or don't buy more time from them, you're going to miss that opportunity to control the message. So you must make sure that they're capturing all their stakeholders, who's communicating with them, when they're communicating, and when's the next communication can be really, really important. Now, stakeholders as well is also about your team. So as new team members come into the room and they need to be briefed, you have to think, how are you going to do that? So watching the interaction within the crisis team itself can be really important as well, especially if it's a long exercise and you might want to test a handover from team A to team B. How do they hand that over? How do they share that information? How do they share the logs and what's happened can be just as important as the communications around the team as well. And then within that, the communications tools you use. So how are you communicating? How are you sharing information? And how are you capturing information becomes really important. We have so many teams debate, should we use Microsoft 365 shared files? Should we use a Google file? Should we use a tool for this and a tool for that? Should we just record on a whiteboard? Should I write it down? Should I not write it down? It has to suit the team. It has to suit the company. It has to suit the legal ramifications of all those different modes and ways of doing things. But you have to talk about it, and you've got to work out what's the best way for the team to capture that, because it's such a vital part of every exercise and every team.
Indeed. Let's just skip along because I know time is marching.
So 4 key things we want to make sure you take away from this presentation, because we are at Q&A time. So 1, be clear on objectives. We've said it a few times, but it really can help you to frame the exercise to really drive success, because you can bring it back to, what did we achieve in the exercise? Doesn't match the objectives. Did we meet our objectives or even exceed them? Keep it simple and succinct. You can have a very complex situation unfold, but the exercise can be simple in the way that it's worded and the injects that you give. So few words on an inject can explode into a big exercise.
I'll just add on that one. That's not a suggestion to wing it. That simplicity and that succinctness usually comes from the depth and the quality of your planning and your preparation. And the analogy, there's a very old piece of wisdom that says, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. And I think that applies in this work as well.
True. It's very true. Exercise, don't test. You want people to come back for more. The only way they're not going to come back for more is if you create a safe environment and a safe space for them to fail and be okay with that, because they walk away and learn. So that safe environment and stressing it. Like, we always start our exercises with, this is not a test. We're not going to give you a mark out of 10. So there's no right or wrong. So give it a go, because that's okay. And finally, keep it interesting. Make it fun. Make it something that is topical. think about what are they going to leave the room with that they can actually take away to their day job that might actually help them. And maybe it'll help them become better managers or better leaders or better understand a topic. So on that note, do we have any questions? Do we have any chats or Q&As? Feel free to post them in the chat or in the Q&A. Peter and I have a lot more war stories we could go into, but we want to make sure that we tailor it to the audience we have. While everyone's thinking, I think one of the key fundamentals to every exercise is containment. So what I mean by containment is making sure that the exercise stays within the exercise. So keeping vigilant of, are people starting all communications with exercise, or this is an exercise, is really important. I had a person go to the stock exchange to try and put a hold on shares. They were walking up the stairs when they phoned to say, okay, I'm here, what do I tell them? When we realized they hadn't heard the exercise. So containing the exercise, super important. Making sure all communications out of the room say that, in the room say that, beforehand they have to say exercise on, because you don't want anyone to think, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. So keep that in mind.
It's very true, Craig. I worked in an organization that, amongst other interesting things, had it ran an ocean-going vessel, and there was an exercise that was run. Pleased to say that Craig and I weren't involved in this particular exercise, and the chief executive's EA was not briefed that it was an exercise, and some exercise communications came to her attention, and she thought this ship had sunk and that people had drowned, and and apparently she was distressed for at least 5 minutes before someone realized what had gone on.
Yep. So a question from Steve: what advice can you give to get executive leadership involved to sponsor and lead? They seem to want them, but don't prioritize time to participate. The age-old conundrum. Look, it's really hard if they're not going to prioritize. However, maybe ask for less time, or work out, is it something that the board is asking for or an auditor's asking for? So you have a different levers you can pull, right? You've got the auditors say we must do an exercise, or the board wants an exercise, or, okay, I don't need 2 hours, just give me 1 hour. If you do what I find is if you do a really good exercise the first time, they are usually happy to come back for more. As someone else put in the chat, or a regulator might require it. It's really hard if they don't want to buy in, but you've got to work out how to get someone above you, more senior, to try and get them to buy into it. Another question from Bridget. Hello, Bridget. I've used MS Teams to prepare for crisis management before and used the tools during the exercise. What are your thoughts on this? You have to use tools that the company knows and uses every day, right? So if MS Teams is the way to communicate within the company you're working with, then use Teams. If it's Zoom, if it's Google Meet, whatever it is. I'm not a big believer in inventing a tool to run the exercise if they're not going to use that when the actual incidents happen. So keeping it real, keeping within the tool set they have. Now, it might come out that they don't have the right tools, and that's a good outcome. Then you can go find the right tools and train them in it and bring it in-house. But to have it, use the tools that they're used to: Slack, Teams, Zoom, Word, Excel, whatever it is, and how can they best use the tools that they have. Michaela, to the earlier question, we link our emergency preparedness to our top strategic risks with an executive owner. We seem to get great traction. That is a great idea. And I always like to bring it back to risk management as well. So, well, let's test something that's on your risk, because that can, your risk register, because that can really hit home and really help to get buy-in. So
Craig, there's a good question here about how do you run crisis exercises for companies with a low maturity level, and what are the key things to consider? And I think the first thing, and we can hopefully come through in our presentation, is recognizing that that's where you're operating, and so you're at the crawl end of the crawl, walk, run continuum. So it becomes a learning affair. It's about presenting the plan, stepping people through each element of this plan, stepping people through the different roles. You might use some very, very simple scenarios to illustrate relevant points, but you're not going to push people harder or faster than you know they're going to be able to cope. And then you build that up over time. And then the next one, you escalate to being a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further, and you get there. But it is really important that it's all about that initial recognition of the maturity level of the group.
Yeah. And don't go too hard, because if you do, you'll scare them.
Yes.
I was going to a room thinking, I want them to come back for more. So what do I need to do that they leave and go, I want more? Right? If you stress them out too much or go too far, they're not going to want to come. They're not going to want to come back for more. There's really interesting Q&As around, should the CEO be in the crisis team? How do you decide who the stakeholders are? Can anyone be a stakeholder? Look, I don't know if there's right or wrong answers for all of that stuff, but we're strong believers that the CEO should not be the crisis leader. They need to be the CEO. Whether they're in a crisis team or not, I haven't met a CEO yet who wants to not be in a crisis team, but they're not there to lead. They're there to observe, see what's going on, think strategically, answer questions, maybe decide things that only the CEO can. But it really depends on the individual. I have run exercises in the past where the CEO is determined to be the lead, and we've exercised to show them how they can't be the lead. So there can be a goal you have as part of the exercise to prove or disprove whether people can play their roles in an exercise or not, which is very, very interesting.
They are interesting ones, and just on that point. So when we talk about demonstrating that it's hard to be the lead, that's when you tailor the exercise so that the chief executive's constantly being driven out to deal with media, is being constantly taken out of the room to brief board members, so on, and to exercise those delegations and responsibilities that only a chief executive has. And then so often when you do that, thankfully we don't have to do that sort of exercise all that often. You then see the crisis team grind to a halt.
Yep. And that's what they were trying to overcome, right? Prove it to show why it's an issue. Yep. It's the same way that when you have multiple teams, you have like a crisis team and some other team, and they have to interact during an exercise, and how they interact, and people leaving the room and missing information. That's all great learnings to uncover. But at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong with crisis teams either. I know there's lots of questions about assigning roles, not assigning roles. I've seen crisis teams work really well, where the CEO's first job is pick someone to lead based on a set of criteria. And after that, they will then decide the team. I've seen others where it's very rigid. You have a trained set of crisis leaders, a trained set of crisis coordinators, and they do their job. It depends on the organization, but whatever the outcome, whoever's playing the roles needs to be trained, and they need to be exercised. Don't expect that someone can just drop into a crisis leadership role and know what to do, because it's not your day-to-day. It's like you've got to put your undies on the outside and become the superhero, right? The mild-mannered billionaire by day and the superhero by night. When you're asked to transform into that crisis lead or coordinator or deputy, you need to be given the tools. You need to be given the experiences and the training to do that. Otherwise, it's just not fair. So our job is to arm people with that. Thank you so much for attending the webinar. We will share the slides through the BCI. There'll be a recording. You can write to us, Peter at battleground.com.au, Craig at battleground.com.au. feel free to reach out and we'll answer many more questions. But thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.